So it's the final discussion now, and the panelists are Baroness Joanna Shields, who is online, Prof. Wang Lin Fa, Professor Damien O'Connell, Dr. Ho Chao Seng, if you could join us, and Dr. Fida Elsegoff is the moderator for Science, Technology, and Innovation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're now on session 3 of today's Temasek Shophouse Conversation. We started this COVID-19 conversation with a very large remit, international collaboration. And then we brought it local, and we talked about the community. Today, we bring a different community, if you will, the scientific community, and we want to discuss their perspectives. Professor Tang Cho Chuan said in the very first session, he said something that really struck me because it was so true. He said for COVAX, it was a ship that was being built as it was being sailed. I thought that was priceless. But that applied to so many parts of the equation. We had to launch, we had to learn very quickly and robustly because people's lives and safeties were at stake. Today, we have 4 different individuals from different spheres who all have unique stories to talk about. And we're going to let them share a little bit of the key messages they wanted to highlight, and then we want to go into some of the pertinent issues, lessons learned, especially areas that could prepare us ultimately to be much more prepared for disease acts. So first on the list, all the way in the United Kingdom, in a lovely countryside, we have Baroness Joanna Shields. She represents technology, health, and policy. She began her career early on in, companies you might have heard of, Facebook, Amazon, AOL, and then a career followed after a long tenure there in policy in the UK. And it's so much that she's done. You have the CV. Please read it in detail. But she does understand policy remarkably well. And her latest foray is in the intersection of technology and healthcare. She is Chief Executive Officer of Benevolent AI. That's a leader in the development and application of AI as it pertains to understanding disease causation, finding new drugs, and its application to medicine. So I'm going to let Joanna take us through a few slides first. Through the wonders of technology, we are connected to you halfway across the world. Joanna, welcome. We hand the time over to you.
Oh, thank you, Fida. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Within days of identifying a novel coronavirus in Wuhan, Professor Zhang of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Professor Holmes at the University of Sydney made its entire genomic sequence available to any researcher around the world with an internet connection. The pair urged scientists to download and share and analyze their data, starting a year of rapid global scientific collaboration. And as a result, an armory of COVID-19 vaccines have been produced in record time, challenging our paradigm of what is possible if we harness new technologies. The success of the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna mRNA vaccines bring hope that we can leverage this new technology in future pandemics to accelerate vaccine development and manufacturing processes without compromising safety or efficacy. These scientific triumphs are a testament to what can be achieved when we fuse human ingenuity with technology. And it speaks to the very heart of what we do at Benevolent AI. We believe that new technologies can be powerful allies in the fight against disease, augmenting human intelligence and empowering scientists to discover novel, life-changing treatments. Complex diseases that have defied conventional research efforts, such as glioblastoma and ALS, and chronic conditions such as Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. We did not build our platform to focus on infectious diseases, yet responding to the COVID global pandemic crisis, we were able to pivot our research towards understanding the body's response to this deadly virus. In January 2020, at the urging of FIDA and Temasek, with thousands of patients who were already critically ill, we formed a specialist Benevolent AI team and mobilized to identify existing drugs that were already proven safe that could be used to treat the virus until vaccines were developed and available. What you can see on this slide is a simplified representation of how over a single weekend, Benevolent AI scientists leveraged our models and platform tools to reason across vast quantities of curated biomedical information to identify and ultimately select baricitinib, an approved oral rheumatoid arthritis drug, as a potential treatment. It was logical to examine the potential of anti-inflammatory drugs for COVID-19. However, our AI platform uncovered previously unknown antiviral properties of the drug, meaning that it could inhibit both the process by which the virus infects cells, as well as effectively reduce the body's extreme immune response, referred to as the cytokine storm. We published our hypotheses in The Lancet on February 4th, and by April, the U.S. National Institute of Infectious and Allergy and Diseases in the U.S. and Eli Lilly, who own the drug, began a large-scale clinical trial. In November, research published in Science Advances showed that baricitinib contributed to a 71% reduction in mortality in elderly patients with moderate to severe COVID-19. And based on the results from the NIAID trial, baricitinib was granted FDA emergency use authorization alongside of remdesivir, and is now being administered to patients in the United States. We expect more confirmatory data following the conclusion of Eli Lilly's independent trial and the UK's recovery trial. However, we've been frustrated by the lack of use of baricitinib in more parts of the world, specifically for hospitalized COVID-19 patients requiring oxygen. The NIAID clinical trial data published in the New England Journal of Medicine in December indicated that a 7-day oral course of treatment would be most beneficial for this hospitalized cohort of patients, meaning that we could be saving even more lives today. This reveals how the medical establishment has struggled to adopt to novel treatment paradigms during the pandemic. Nonetheless, the speed at which we were able to identify an effective treatment demonstrates the potential of these new technologies. However, while the pandemic has validated the power of these technologies like mRNA and AI, the moment has also been matched by the best in human ingenuity. The pandemic has spotlighted the importance of global collaboration amongst researchers, companies, doctors, and government bodies. For instance, despite perceived rivalries between China and the US, the two countries collaborated on more than 120 COVID-19 studies by June last year. The pandemic has raised questions about the importance of making relevant data sets available and open. Machine learning models and algorithms can interrogate vast quantities of biomedical data, but the quality of that data has a direct impact on the value of hypotheses generated. And as COVID-19 is ultimately a novel problem, collecting and applying quality data has been a challenge in a very short period of time. If we are to defeat this virus and face future health crises, we must focus on realizing and releasing as much relevant data and to advance machine learning models and leverage that towards enhancing scientific knowledge for the benefit of all. However, some countries have been less transparent and forthcoming with their data for fear of the consequences. In the UK, we have world-leading genomic surveillance capabilities, and as a result have sequenced half the world's COVID viral samples. We rapidly sounded the alarm in September of a recent discovery of a new COVID variant, and subsequently, most countries have shut their borders to us. This is understandable. However, I believe that countries should not be stigmatized for their transparency. We live in a hyper-connected world, and we must encourage and reward open data sharing to understand the progression of this pandemic and to prevent future ones. Multilateral cooperation is the key to ensuring the development of machine learning models and data-driven research, and we have to make sure this is used for the benefit of all. This is at the core of what I do as the co-chair of the Global Partnership on AI. Founded by France and Canada in 2019, and now supported by 40 countries and the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI aims to advance AI responsibly and ethically and support cutting-edge research projects worldwide. By bringing together world-leading experts in AI from science, industry, civil society, governments, international organizations, and academia, the Global Partnership on AI is working to establish a framework for collaborative governance of new technology and ensure that AI is a force for good. Although GPAY is a new organization, in the grips of the global pandemic, we mobilized a worldwide network of experts and across 5 working groups, including one on the pandemic response. Following this example and encouraging more scientists to collaborate for the common good will ensure that this kind of global collaboration becomes the norm, not the exception. It is a dangerously false narrative to consider pandemics as black swan events that occur idiosyncratically every 100 to 200 years. We have to accept and prepare for the next global health emergency now. And we need to use this opportunity to develop AI and other advanced technologies to prevent disease, advance the deployment of new treatments, and to protect human health at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Certainly very many interesting issues that we can talk about, particularly new technologies that come up face problems of inertia and acceptance, and we've seen that. And perhaps we can deal with that a little later. I want to just invite everyone, as you are tuning in, please send your questions over, and we will have some time to take on some of your questions. I'm going to move on now to Professor Wang Lin-Fa. He's a virologist par excellence. Currently, he is professor in the program in emerging infectious diseases in our Duke NUS Medical School, which Cho Chuan had a major hand in setting up. The factoid I wanted to share with everyone here, apart from his remarkable career in academia, is that Lin-Fa in 1990 joined CSIRO in Australia, where he played a leading role in identifying bats as the natural host for SARS. So good fortune for us. The pioneer is here. And so I'm going to hand over the time now to you, Lin-Fa, to share your thoughts.
Thank you for the introduction. Can I have the slides? You know, as a scientist, I always like to talk with slides. Okay, so it's going to 3 really science, innovation, and the lessons learned, you know. The remote control is not working. Maybe we have switched. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I have been talking about, you know, asked to talk about the importance of digitization, but I think this is the first month. Cho Chuan already says, you know, early prevention is the key. And this, to me, is the major early event. Out of all this, that's the one, release of the sequence. And it's being talked about, you know, previous speakers, even DPM said this. I'm going to not repeat this, but there's in the lessons learned, I'm going to say that, you know, although it's maybe provocative, we could have done 2 weeks earlier. In a pandemic preparedness, if you can that 2 weeks earlier, that would make a huge difference, and that's lesson 1. So in the innovation, the translation, real impact, you know, I had the personal joy of developing this CPAS. Again, DPM mentioned that. So I tried to really lead you guys through this, you know. So I use the science term here, serology. For layman, basically, is the measuring of the antibody in your blood. So I have listed here, I'm going to not read through this, you know, the herd immunity, immune passport. It's all very topical right now. And then in blue, equally topical. We still don't know where this virus was from. 17 years ago, I led an international team to solve that. Right now, we're still in the dark. So both of these, which use serology, is very important. There's a term called the neutralizing antibody. When you get infected or vaccinated, there'll be hundreds of thousands of different antibodies. Only 1 to 3% is functional, neutralizing. So we need that test to zoom in to test neutralizing antibody. And for tracing animals, what we need a test is that universal, species independent. We can test human, bats, pangolins, elephants, snakes, you name it, okay? So with these challenges, and by coincidence, I was in Wuhan, January 14th, 18th. And I already had this kind of a very bad feeling that this is going to be different from SARS. We need an exit strategy. So I called my postdoc, said, let's focus on serology. So serology, the gold standard is this virus neutralization test to test this very specific antibody. Unfortunately, for SARS, COVID-19, Ebola, these are highly dangerous. So you need a facility, you need a PPE, and you need to handle live virus. So the advantage is very specific. The disadvantage is many. It's very slow, not safe, costs money. And so what we came up with this concept, surrogate virus neutralization. I'm not going to give a lecture here. We got a paper, but more importantly is we had a commercialized test launched in Singapore on May 15th. So just give you the perspective. We had a concept end of February. We went through this proof of concept, patent application, publication, HSA approval, launch a product, 70 days. I always say, people say, why can you do it? Because I say I have 30 years of experience and I'm in Singapore. Because this is very important. Science combined with all the, Prof. Tan was training that weekly meeting. And this is a collaboration of Duke Yes, GeneScript, and DXD. Prof. Tan linked me with Sidney Yee, the CEO, and also HSA. Everything was done so rapidly. So, and it's so simple, even I can do it, so that must be very simple. Now, the real benchmark, I'm a scientist of 30 years working in pandemics, and I have published 500 papers, many patents, but I have never reached world first FDA approved. This is the first, and I can add, only neutralizing test approved by FDA. Why it's important? Because it's important for the exit strategy and for search of the animal reservoir. The test now is being used by WHO, FAO, and OIE. And I have paper coming out, I cannot say much, but we already use that to investigate related virus in our neighborhood, and this will be published very soon. But for the exit strategy, I think I'm really excited. My dream is that, on behalf of myself, Duke Yes Singapore, I want this COVID pass, that's the name of the technology, CPass. I want this to be a popular verb for 2021. Because that if you are infected or you are vaccinated, does not mean you're protected. We need another layer. So another layer, of course, neutralizing antibody is one of them. There are other measures. So we're hoping that this will become an important, really top layer of safety. For example, the Singapore airline will be the world's first airline, all vaccinated. So my dream is to say we'll be the first airline CPassed. And that means that it's really secure for the passenger as well. So just to finish up on the lessons from pandemic preparedness, again, in February, I published this in Lancet. I'm not going to through this, but one important is that 100 years later, we're still using cost postulate. So basically, if you have new pandemic, we like to see the virus. We like to make sure that virus caused this pandemic. So that's where I said at the beginning that if we use a new sort of paradigm, use sequencing information to inform that, we may actually can gain 2 weeks in the current pandemic, and in future pandemic, we have other things we can improve. And there are other lessons I learned, less scientific, but equally important. And I'm a Batman, so people always say, you are the fault, you found the virus in bats, and then I try to say it's not bats' fault. And also, don't mix politics with pandemic. Now, I'm going to come to Chao Cheng, and this I prepared before I realized you're the panel member as well. But this is the one you said in 2016, outbreaks should be really considered as a global security issue. And I think this message is still not being really taken seriously. So I'm going to finish it with a very provocative sort of my proposal, science and policy is that I'm conflicted because I'm sitting on 5 WHO committees, so I'm speaking as a personal opinion. There's a lot of debate. about the role WHO played, and I was on the committee to declare the public health emergency, And so I'm not comment there. What I try to say is that the lesson personally for me is science is important, but international response in the first few days is even more important. So I was thinking to myself, before I prepared this, we have the WHO model, we have the Interpol model, okay? So Interpol is for the International Criminal Police Organization. I'm starting thinking maybe, as Chao Cheng you're saying, is a global security, and for future pandemic preparedness, I think that we may have to consider a different model. It's not to criticize WHO, I'm on the committee, but I think just food for thought. I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lin Fa. I was just thinking, if you can only do simple things, I should go home now. But you did raise a very important point. So advance notice to all panelists, we should drill into this, which is really your comment that first you mentioned, Lin Fa, that 2 weeks makes a lot of difference. Biao Qi mentioned 1 day makes a lot of difference. It all boils down to the fact that the virus is exponential. But we think in a linear manner. That's how the system is made to think. And we know what happened when we think linearly in the face of an exponential problem. So heads up, we'd like to address that a bit more. Lin Fa, you had some gems already. We'll come back to that. But we do want to hear from the next panelist who, he's not in the UK, although he's from Ireland, I think, Damien. Professor Damien O'Connell is holed up in some luxurious hotel somewhere, serving his SHN, not because he has the virus, but because he's just returned to Singapore. Damien his expertise is in drug development. And a vast part of his life is in industry. He is currently CEO of the Experimental Drug Development Center, one of the newer centers, right, Damien, under the A-star stable. But before that, my goodness, look at what you've been doing. SVP in drug discovery, the global head of clinical sciences in Bayer Pharma AG. You have been in Pfizer, Park Davis, Elan, Nurex. You've been in a lot of places. And we're very lucky you're here now. I'm going to hand this time over to you to share your perspectives with us.
Thank you very much, Lin Fa, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just go to my third slide and just share my experience in the year gone by for COVID, what EDDC, the Experimental Drug Development Center, has been doing. It exemplifies a number of themes today in terms of teamwork, coordination, really leveraging knowledge across a disparate area. We were involved in the original Fortitude toolkit, the diagnostics. You heard Sebastian and others, Lin Fa, say that the essentially sharing of that genomic sequence was very important to allow us to develop the diagnostic kit. And the reality is the speed, and we've heard about speed being paramount here today. From that original release, we went in 3 weeks to the actual approval of that kit, to a point that with our sister DXD Hub, a national other center for diagnostics, that approval and kit deployment first rapidly deployed in our hospitals here in Singapore, but then subsequently has been exported, and as the Deputy Prime Minister corrected me today, is now in 47 countries that we've rolled it out. Beyond their diagnostic effort, though, we've been involved in therapeutics, and I want to actually make a critical point here today. There's been a lot of talk about vaccines, and I fear somehow that people feel vaccines are the panacea, that is the one and only cure. Joanna has already mentioned, we actually have patients, and we're fortunate here in Singapore at this time, we're not in that firestorm, but there is a firestorm going on in many countries. First world countries like the UK, the US, and indeed in my home country in Ireland. There are patients dying today because vaccines don't work for them. We've heard about the repurposing of drugs and the criticality of that, but frankly, we've very few drugs that essentially have been approved. And without that fact, we have patients dying still. Many, many millions essentially dying, and we're in that firestorm. We have been working, and one of the additional therapeutic options here, beyond the repurposing and the anti-inflammatories, is the potential for monoclonal antibodies. We've been fortunate to be able to work with the Defense Science Organization here, to develop a monoclonal antibody with other partners such as NUS and Hummingbird. What I want to point out here is this teamwork that allowed us to bring from the original identification of this antibody in March to a point that we actually had a first dose in human in the 29th of October. Now, I would argue, given my industry background, that's at a speed that's commensurate with what you would see in industry. Yet we're not collectively an industry, but the sheer nature of that partnership led us in that speed. We've heard about warp speed. I'm not sure it's warp 9, but it's probably warp 5. Critical to the success of that, though, was a relationship with the HSA, the ability to do real-time engagement with the HSA, to bring information real-time, to allow for a rolling submission, which has been a critical component of us successfully bringing that into patients. You know, we've also coordinated, as indeed Joanna pointed out, the criticality of AI. We also work with AI. It's a critical component now of drug discovery and development. And we leveraged other AI companies in the context of repurposing. And indeed, we worked very hand in glove with local biotech support to ensure that we were able to see whether or not some of their compounds could be repurposed also for therapeutic effect. Finally, what we're doing, and I think, you know, a theme that I want to come back on reflections at the end, we're now working on a small molecule to make it available for the next corona pandemic. I am quite convinced we will have another at some point. Is it going to be COVID-25, COVID-32, or COVID something else? Who knows? But surely we must have learned our lessons from SARS and MERS. There will be another. Why did we have to do repurposing? Because in reality, there was nothing available for us that was purposed specifically to treat such coronaviruses. Surely we must learn. What are my reflections, so to speak, in terms of the last year? I've mentioned about the criticality of speed and partnership. I've mentioned the criticality of working with agencies, with HSA, but also you have to work globally. We've heard that again and again today. You have to leverage information across the whole global community to really succeed here. And it is critical that we know how to do that even better going forward. We've also learned of some critical bottlenecks. Here in Singapore, we did not have enough BCL3 facilities. In fact, globally, BCL3 facilities have been critical in trying to understand how the virus responds to some of these agents. Even beyond the BCL3, there's been a huge stampede to leverage toxicology and other supports for the various agents coming out. Simply, there wasn't the means by which everybody could get the same access. And sometimes, frankly, the power of the dollar or whatever was important in whether you were first, second, or third, notwithstanding the value of the asset you were trying to bring. I think going forward as well, how do we incentivize somebody to develop a compound that will make it available, even though it won't be commercially valuable for whoever manufactures it until and such time as that next pandemic, i.e. it will be sitting somewhere, probably have limited value immediately, but critical value for us as and when. We learned and we've seen, had we been able to treat some of these patients early, beyond vaccines, we would not be in the storm that we are still in. So those are my reflections and thoughts of how and what I've been privileged to be able to do in Singapore, but also what we need to do going forward in terms of not being caught out a second time or a third time or a fourth time with such a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Damien. Quite a few nuggets in there, and I'd like to come back to that in a while, but I'd like to turn our attention now to our fourth panelist, Dr. Ho Chao Seng. Different background. He is an electrical engineer and a computer scientist. From industry, like Damien, a career in Hewlett-Packard and Chartered Semiconductor, and then he co-founded and is currently still managing director of the National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Cluster, or NAMIC. It's a SingGov platform initiative. And what Chao Seng seeks to do is to catalyze innovation and scale industrial adoption of digital additive manufacturing technologies, 3D printing. And the reason why we brought Chao Seng in here is because he was instrumental in solving our complete shortage of swabs. you can have all the wonderful lab equipment, but the humble swab was bringing us down. So Chao Seng, I'll hand the time over to you to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Frida. Good afternoon, everyone, for those on the line. I'd like to start off by saying that, first and foremost, I'm an optimist, and I think there's a lot of optimists in this room. And as a global community, we have made stunning strides in recent decades, tackling some of the world's cruelest tragedies. Consider one, for example, child mortality. Every day, 17,000 new lives get to be lived by children who would have died just a quarter century ago. Yet some of our toughest challenges today, like inequality, haven't really improved, right? In fact, they've actually become worse. Malnutrition, disease continue to kill millions, straining healthcare systems in both rich and poor countries. And the devastating threat of climate change looms, hitting the poorest the hardest. So if we were to reduce this suffering, my view is that humanity as a whole need to come up with bold new solutions. But to have any chance of solving these problems, what is feasible today will not be enough. Instead, we must look at what is currently impossible and do what we can to overcome the limits of what humanity can accomplish. And these limits are real, and as they cap our aspirations for change. This is why I think a few of the speakers before us has mentioned this as well, that science and technology have been so critical in the history of civilization. Technology progress expands the possibilities of human achievement, increasing our collective capability to solve problems that were once considered unsolvable. So my message is very simple, is that first and foremost, I'm a fan of science and technology, and the progress of science and technology is going through the greatest acceleration of all time. Second, this is the greatest opportunity we've had for generations to advance the causes of social justice, equality, and the reduction of human suffering. And third, and the foremost, is that we need new incentive structures as well to continue to encourage our brightest minds and technologists to take on society's greatest challenges, and also to do this with ethics at their heart. As what Frida mentioned, I'm an electrical engineer, so I'd like to, in some ways, highlight that, at the heart of all this technology evolution that we're seeing today is the invention of the transistor and the birth of the semiconductor industry. So infinite computing today is a confluence of three trends, as we see it: exponential increase in the available computing power, democratized access to that power, and the precipitous fall in the cost of that power. And when you combine these trends with the scalability that we can now access via the cloud, we can deploy hundreds, even thousands of computers to help solve the growing number of challenges we face as designers, engineers, artists, and even doctors. So our mission as a whole is that we are trying, at the heart of what we do is we are connectors of people, idea, and technology. And what we're trying to do is to build this global interconnected network of thought leaders, research performers, as well as industry players, so as to develop and deploy industry-relevant technologies and solutions for our community. And one of the things that I wanted to share in our COVID-19 response, and this is one of the case studies to illustrate how the global 3D community has risen up to the challenge to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in terms of the rapid response to develop and manufacture personal protective equipments and test diagnostic devices such as the humble nasopharyngeal swabs. In Singapore, we actually have plugged ourselves as one of the global 3D printing resource nodes through a resource matchmaking platform, facilitating medical communities seeking solutions to connect with resource providers with global as well as local-based 3D printing providers. And one of the example that I would end with this is that, in our experience when we were going through this body of work to develop this product, and I think Temasek actually, in a lot of ways for me personally, came to the rescue. In the early stage when we first had this concept of a 3D printer swapped, we had the concept, but we have no product. So we had to secure basically the commercial commitment in order for us to convince our supply chain ecosystem, both local in Singapore as well as in some parts of the other countries like US, for example. And we have actually been able to amalgamate all the resources, working with the 3D printing companies, which are all competitors in their day job, but because of the situation, they all came together, basically no egos, and were able to work with us to come up with a design that was patient trial and clinically validated. And the outcome is that we've actually been able to ramp up the manufacturing from the start of the program, 7 weeks from the time when we actually started, developing the device. The companies so far that has actually licensed this includes the US, a company called Printer Press, which is a startup and based in San Francisco, as well as Think3D in India, which is a dedicated service bureau, as well as a company in Indonesia. So I wanted to end with this, and back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Chao Seng. I thought, it's very easy to be dominated just with the drug, the vaccine and therapeutics part of the fence. But the story of the shortfall of the swabs tells us that certainly in a situation like this, we have to think holistically end to end for the whole system, everything that's needed. After the swabs, the next problem was the UTM and the tubes. So not very sexy things, but highly problematic. But we have 10 minutes, just short of 10 minutes. And with the panelists' permission, I'd like to just grapple with one issue, and you all touched on it in various ways. The problem, as Biao Chi had described in her very moving stories that she was telling, is this is a case, and Linfa knows this very well as the virologist here. One case in 3 days becomes 2, in 6 days become 4, and so on and so forth. How do you deal with that? And you mentioned different things. Speed is important, but if you think about that, in our experience in Singapore, we weren't doing too badly thinking linearly. We had a lead. We could do it, but if you sit down and do the math, you'd know that at some point it will overwhelm you. So how do you deal with it? What are the pillars we need to think about in terms of readiness for pandemic or disease acts? And I want to come back to what you said, Linfa. It's not as if this is a new thing for us, a zoonotic disease jumping off on an animal to a human and causing that problem. So if you know where it is, in an exponential situation, stop it happening, if possible. So prevention, you had some very novel ideas. So novel, actually, it's really worth thinking through. I wanted to come and ask you, what would you recommend? We know where the pangolins are, the bats are, we know where they are, the civet cats, we know where they are. What do we do?
Yeah, so I think, it's a very challenging area. I think, Joanna, to solve this, we need to work much closer. So what I call myself is a basic scientist to look at the wet science. So now we have tools. We can go to an animal with a drop of blood. I can do 200,000 tests in one go in 1 hour. Trouble is the data. So classically, I do one test, say, do I have HIV or do I have hepatitis B? If it's no, you go back to doctor. Doctor prescribe another one. The technology is ready. We can do lots of these tests simultaneously. But I think first is the AI side. I think we need to improve. But more importantly, is that's what I think this conversation is very important. Science, the legal frame, and the policy. So if you discover something, how do you act? Okay, so I think I just leave that to give you to start thinking about this, because this is a technology. We have wet science and dry science, and I think we can push it. In the next 5-10 years, we can get to really sophisticated. Then the legal and the political framework need to catch up. That's why I put the Interpol model there. Is, I have worked with WHO 17 years ago. I was on the mission right now in China, the WHO mission to investigate the origin and the transmission, early transmission in of SARS. That's in August. We know nothing about bats in those days. We had unlimited access, no news, no mention. The 8 international experts was not listed on the internet. And the deputy director of CDC, now, she goes to White House and, meets with President Trump on a regular basis. She was on the team. We had access to the military institute in Beijing. So this is the sad part, I feel like 17 years ago, science goes that way, politics go the other way. So to me is that the challenge is scientifically, I think we can work closer. AI definitely will play a very important role. But on top of that, we need the legal and the politics to catch up.
And certainly I think Damien addressed some of that in his comments, but Joanna at its very beginning already touched on that. Artificial intelligence, it's not as if that was invented during COVID-19. It's been around for a few years. It's getting more complex, higher utility. We're seeing the fruits of it, and yet very intelligent professionals had problems accepting the evidence. And that was the evidence. So Joanna, from your perspective as someone putting boots in the field, using artificial intelligence, it must have been extremely frustrating to find something. I remember the conviction in all your eyes as you talked about baricitinib, and you found it in 4 days, which was remarkable. Convincing the rest took months. What needs to change? Not so much just AI, we agree that's an enabling tool, but there will be many enabling tools that we'll have to accept. What in your mind needs to change in our mindsets as doctors and clinicians, as policy regulators, policymakers and regulators? What do you think?
I was intrigued by what Lin Fang said about the global health emergency should be a global security emergency. My background has been in, as a minister for internet safety and security, was keeping the national grid safe and protecting from attack and various other things. And when you think about this disease as an attack, it truly was a global security issue. And whenever the WHO declared that this was a global health emergency, I immediately thought that that meant that there would be resources and people would be collaborating and wanting to hear about, innovation and what was happening. But I was really surprised at just the research that we were doing. We were fortunate to get the Lancet's attention early on. But beyond that original article, more or less, lots of naysayers and a lot of people just didn't jump on the invention. So it was quite surprising. So we kept releasing more data, and we kept speaking to the company that owns the drug, Eli Lilly, and they went very quiet. And it took them a couple of weeks, but they came back and actually proved our hypotheses. And then they started engaging with us. But without the power of a big pharma behind us, we really didn't have a voice in the conversation. So I think that when you look at these crises in the future, if you declare a global health emergency, you have to declare a mobilization plan alongside of it. And I think all governments need to agree to put all resources and to have, whatever the number of plans need to be in place to implement simultaneously and to cooperate globally is absolutely vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touch on a topic we could talk about half a day on in terms of how to, but certainly we'll park it there. It's certainly very important. Till today, I think baricitinib isn't as widely prescribed, and this is a oral small molecule drug that's been used for 18 years. But so certainly some mindsets there need to be changed. The global mindset for sure, and that's been touched on in the first session, for sure. But I want to go to another area which actually Damon alluded to directly in one and indirect to the other. Damon, you said that in your experience working with our regulator here in Singapore, HSA, it was very positive. And, yes. and many parties have said so. Things were done remarkably quickly. They were very responsive. Say some more about what worked in what HSA did that we should enshrine and try to push out. And if you are talking to the CEO of HSA, what would be your wish list? The 1 or 2 things that could make this even better?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's critical here is that the situation was a crisis. So we know that we needed to potentially bring this project forward rapidly to potentially make it available first and foremost for possible emergency use here in Singapore, not knowing where and how this whole pandemic might evolve within Singapore. So I think what's critical is transparency, early engagement with the HSA, telling them very rapidly what you're thinking about doing, when you're going to get data, being very frank and open about some of the data you don't have, some of the issues that might be arising in the interpreting, and not, so to speak, somehow putting that below the surface and then coming later. So I think it's the honesty of the discussion that was critical here, being clear with the agency that there were certain data sets we would not have until quite late in the day, which of course were critical for them to assess whether or not this project was safe, because ultimately regulatory authorities are ensuring and enshrining the safety of any intervention clinically. So they had to trust us that we would provide it as we planned at risk for the trials, so to speak, here in Singapore. So I think it was very important that we had that dialogue, and it is an ongoing dialogue. And of course, they come back to us and ask for additional elements and additional data. So it was very important for us to be responsive as well. So it really was not just a sort of agency and us, so to speak, on the other side. It was a collective effort. And I think that was the difference here. We were all working to the same end, was to potentially make this a project that could go into the clinic, recognizing that potential need to have an alternative therapeutic option. And that end was clear for us all. And I think, you know, what I would say is that maybe in that context, the lessons learned going forward, that it shouldn't take a pandemic for us to necessarily understand the criticality of bringing new therapeutics rapidly to patients in other disease areas. Of course, we should never in any way compromise safety, but you know, we've seen that even with the approval of the vaccines. You know, at this point in time, we don't know yet the long-term safety issues that might arise. I don't personally believe they will be major, but of course, that's a leap of faith. We have to recognize sometimes we don't really get to see the real world safety issues until down the line. So it's also the regulators who are not risk averse, who are able to understand risk versus need in the context of a disease setting. And I think in this way, HSA certainly understood the risk and the need and what we were trying to do in the context of this pandemic.
Thank you, Damien. So I think we've basically run out of time. I'm just going to wrap up. But Damien, your point is well noted. You also mentioned there is just a need for more effective, more efficient drug discovery, drug development, and regulation. So absolutely. But you mentioned that enlightened regulation here was you don't have to be an adversarial relationship with the regulator, because at the end of it, we're all going after the same goal. And that's been a very, very strong positive. Ladies and gentlemen, I mean, it's been a pleasure. So many issues. There's no way we could do justice to all of them. And so thank you for that. I would love to catch up with you separately over coffee and talk a lot more, because there's a lot that we can do and should do to prepare for Disease X. But it just leaves me to, you'll be happy, Linfa. We have a question here. Is CPAS available in the market? The answer is yes, it is. Who do they talk to, Linfa?
I think DXD is going to
okay.
offer, yeah.
So the agency, DXD, which is part of A-STAR, if you can just go to the website, reach out to them. It's already being marketed overseas. So this query comes from Indonesia. Another question on contact tracing. Will the data be shared? Well, that's work in progress, but the conversations are going on. First, we need to be able to track and analyze the data. So with that, would you please join me in thanking our participants and panelists, not just for being present today, but for your sterling work over the course of the last 12 months in the battle against COVID-19. Thank you very much.